Catherine Korostoff, and I am thrilled today that we have a special guest lecture with a true NPS expert, Paul Abel. And I've left Paul's bio up here so you can read a little bit about him. But one of the things that I think is really exciting about Paul's background is that he is, like all of us, a market research and insights professional. He has a lot of experience in both qualitative and quantitative research, and he has some really deep expertise in NPS. And obviously, NPS, Net Promoter Score, is a hot topic for many of us in market research. It's been around for a long time, right? But it's still a really hot topic. Now, just for your planning purposes today, Paul is great about answering questions. So if, as we're going along, if you have questions, please do post them in the chat, and I'll let him know when he's got questions to be answered. And some questions he may answer during the lecture, and then some we may choose to save till the end. But please don't be shy about asking questions. He's really happy to share his expertise. And let's see, I think with that, I'm going to bring us into the main room and get us started. Hey folks, great to have you here again. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And I believe we're just going to have Paul come in on his webcam too. Paul, it is great to see you. Thanks again for being here today.
Great. So I'm assuming everybody can hear and see what I'm sharing. If you can't, I suppose, let me know, Catherine.
Yep, I think you may need to reshare your PowerPoint.
I may need to reshare it. Okay. Let me do that.
And while Paul's doing that too, just for those of you, I know we just had several people who just signed in the last few seconds. We are about to get started. And if you have any questions, please don't be shy. Please feel free to post your questions into the Ask Questions chat. Excellent, thank you.
Okay, and Catherine, you are able to see the presentation now, I'm assuming.
Yes, you're still in speaker in the speaker notes view.
Okay, so let me configure the setting.
Perfect.
Okay, so thank you guys for inviting me. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for listening. I thought I would start with just share an experience I had recently before we get into the content. So I was going to the pharmacy, picked up some allergy medication, nothing COVID related, nothing serious. So I went and picked it up, fine experience, went to the counter. They asked me if I had one of those cards, rewards points. I gave it to them. A couple days later, I get an email. It says, great, thank you so much for coming to our pharmacy. One question, just want to ask one simple question, scale 1 to 10, 0 to 10. How likely would you be to recommend our pharmacy? And I was excited to get the question because as a researcher, as a scientist, I often get screened out in any kind of research study. So it was nice to actually have the opportunity to be asked and participate in a survey. So I said to myself, and this is perhaps why scientists and researchers aren't asked, but I said to myself, okay, realistically, would I recommend this pharmacy? Would I go out and tell somebody, hey, you should really go to this pharmacy? And that's what I was asked in the 0 to 10 scale. And so I said to myself, well, I haven't really been asked, and in all likelihood, I wouldn't ask. So I said 0. In all likelihood, I wouldn't recommend this pharmacy to anybody. Not that I had anything wrong with them, but I just wouldn't recommend. So I select 0, great, submit, done. Go back to work. A couple days later, I get a call. Pharmacy manager. Hi, Paul. This is John. I'm from the pharmacy. I'm not going to disclose the pharmacy, but it's one of the big brands. He said, well, at our corporate headquarters, we really take it serious what our customers say. And, you gave us a low score, and I want to make sure, we're doing everything we can to make sure you're satisfied. And so I said, well, I wasn't asked if I'm satisfied. If you asked me that question, I would say absolutely. I went in, people were wearing masks, it was safe, I got through the line really quickly. Satisfied-wise, I was perfectly satisfied. But the question was asking whether, I'd recommend, and I said, yeah, that's not something I would do. If somebody asked me, I'd probably just tell them whichever's closest. They're all about the same. So I was imagining this guy slamming his hand on his forehead or, getting frustrated, shaking his phone. So after a pause, I said, but I'll tell you what, I get it. You're probably getting a performance review based on this. So I'll go back in, I'll respond to the email again, and select a 10, which I did, which is a little bit annoying because as a researcher, you never want to have somebody be able to go back and select another number, but in this case, they allowed me to. So I bring that up because Net Promoter Score, which that's the key question, is a common tool that's used, but there's been a lot of criticisms about it. And the other point of bringing up that story is screening out people that have a science or market research background is probably a good thing when you're asking questions. And asking the right questions is certainly important. Okay, with that said as kind of the context, let me share with you what I want to cover in this lecture. And again, if you have questions, just let me know. We'll talk a little bit about NPS, what it is if anybody's not familiar, briefly, some of the challenges if you're not familiar with those, and then talk about a potential way in which teams can address and could potentially improve what they're getting out of the NPS scores. So I will keep going. If there are questions, let me know. First question you might ask is, what is NPS? So Net Promoter Score, again, brief background for those that may not know. This came out in a December 2003 Harvard Business Review article. And what was promoted, or what the title was, is there's just one number you need to grow your organization. So basically, the idea was, if you want to grow your company, you can, in a sense, use one number, that is customers' loyalty, and use them as a way to effectively use them as a way of employing them in your marketing and your sales team. And that's a good way, this was the proposal, a good way to sort of manage your business, manage your company. And there was data behind this. So, and a lot of fair, good data. So how did this score get created? There was a study that they did where they used 20 different questions that they considered to be the loyalty acid test. And so across 6 industries, 4,000 customers, fairly significant study, right? They looked at the purchase history of somebody, they looked at whether they repurchased, and whether they would recommend that brand to someone else. And then there was a whole slew of other questions around customer satisfaction, your typical set of questions, but there was 20 of them. They looked at all that data, and what they found was the recommendation question, how likely would you be to recommend this brand to someone else, had the strongest correlation. It was ranked number 1 or number 2 in correlation in 11 out of 14 cases with respect to repeat purchase or referrals. So they were tracking actual behavior in addition to what the stated was. So it wasn't the best fit in all cases, and this is correlation, not causation, but it seemed to resonate fairly well. And so what they did afterwards, after coming up with this all you need is one question concept, is they checked it against CAGR, so the growth rates of different companies. And what they found in looking at more than 400 companies using this would you recommend rating scale, that it was correlated with companies that were growing. So over 1999 through 2002, when they looked across different industries, different companies, they found that it seemed as though the Net Promoter Score was higher for companies that were growing at a higher growth rate. And so you can see on the right-hand side there, and to be fair to the critics and for those of you that are already criticizing this, there's a lot of ways to poke holes in this. So one way you could poke holes in this is to say, well, wait a minute, this was .com data. This is 1999 to 2002. Okay, world was different there. On the right-hand side of this chart, you could also pull holes in the fact that this is internet service providers like Earthlink, MSN, AOL, not really still in business, so maybe this isn't as relevant today. As well in the airlines, right? There's TWA, it's scoring fairly poorly, doesn't really exist anymore. So there's a lot of ways that you can poke holes in this, but it was fairly robust from a research intention point of view and a data collection point of view. But there's a lot of things that are not so good with this tool, that are incorrect, that have been shown not to be the case. So for those that, again, may not be too familiar, the categories, so the scale is how likely would you be to recommend brand to a friend or family member on a scale of 0 to 10. And what the team did was they divided the scale into 3 categories. Promoters are those defined as rating a 9 or a 10. Passively satisfied, or passives, rating a 7 or an 8, and then detractors rating 0 through 6. And to calculate the NPS, the net promoter score, it's taking the percent that are promoters minus the percent that are detractors. And one of the interesting things, and this relates to what we'll end up with, is how do you define these 3 categories? Now, there's criticism of using a 0 to 10 scale in the first place, right? So putting that aside, how do you define these 3 categories of 9 to 10, 7 to 8, 0 to 6? What was reported in the original article is that this is based on the clustering. So where there seem to be results clustered around these 7 to 8, 9 to 10, and then 0 to 6. The other point that they made to group these in these categories were based on simplicity. So this is a quote from the article where basically what they said is, it's a lot easier to tell the frontline managers that what your goal is to increase the percent of promoters, decrease the percent of retractors. It's a lot easier to say that, to give them one number to focus in on and 2 audiences, if you will, than to say what you really need to do is increase your mean satisfaction index by 1 standard deviation. Fair enough. So in my example where the pharmacy manager called me, I think it's fair to give them the point that I was listed as a detractor, and it might be easier for that pharmacy manager to say, okay, we got a detractor on our hands, let's call this guy up and find out what's going on, than if they were to see, well, he scored a 4.2 and it really should be a 4.5 as our mean, and we need to increase our standard deviation by 2 points this year, right? So that's Net Promoter Score. That's how they came about it. So what's the problem? So a simple search, simple look anywhere, and you'll see a gazillion problems, right? I'll share just a couple. One is that the values can be misleading. So this is data, sort of a theoretical, from an article that I published a few years ago, and it shows an example that the scores can be misleading. So if you take this top distribution, so we're looking at the score of how likely would you be to recommend 0 to 10, you're looking at a distribution curve there, you might say, okay, this company could improve, but they've got a big chunk of folks that are giving them a 10. So maybe this Net Promoter Score is done a year, maybe a couple years later, and you get a distribution like this on the bottom. Here, you say, yikes, 1 out of 5 are giving them a 0, right? So if you're the manager in this corporation, you say, uh-oh, we got a big problem here, right? It's more of a U-shaped curve than a skewed distribution, and we don't necessarily want to be a U-shaped curve here. The challenge is when you look at the Net Promoter Score and you actually do the calculations, right? What you find on the top, you've got 45% that are promoters, 30% that are detractors, and we don't count the passives, right? So your Net Promoter Score is 15. Now, for those of you that haven't already skipped ahead and done the math, the one on the bottom the detractors actually decreased by 5%. So instead of 30% detractors at the top, you have 25% detractors at the bottom. And so your net promoter score actually increased on the bottom. So in terms of looking at these data, if you're just looking at the NPS values, which oftentimes that's what the board of directors C-level only look at, right? You might mistakenly think we're making progress, and in fact, there's some challenges that might be needed to be addressed. The second point that I'll bring up, criticism, and then we'll go on to the experiment we did, is that it's not necessarily associated with growth. So there's been a lot of critics since this paper was released initially in 2003 that have said, well, wait a minute, is it really connected with growth? Maybe not. We did a simple experiment, again, a couple years ago in a paper, where we looked at a simple way to look at whether it's associated with an increase in CAGR, compound annual growth rate. So what we did is we looked at the years 2012 through 2015, 3 years, not during the dot-com boom. This is quite a bit later, right? And what we did is we took Bain, who promotes a lot of the companies that use NPS, working with Bain. We took all of the companies that they listed at that point on their site that were publicly available, that are public companies where we could get access to their revenues over the course of those years. We compared those 45 companies that were publicly listed against 45 randomly selected public companies, and we looked at what percent of those companies show a positive growth over that time period. So of the companies that are listed as using NPS, 62% grew, had a consistent annual growth rate in the positive over the course of those 3 years. So that's of the 45 companies that we know use NPS based on Bain. The randomly captured companies, 68% of them grew over that same time period. These are not statistically significantly different. So the 68 being higher than the 62 is perhaps just a random chance. But the point being that you might expect companies using NPS, if they're using it well and effectively, you might expect them more often to be growing than the companies that are just captured at random. And that's not what we found. So there's a more comprehensive study that was done in 2007 where they really looked in deep and tried to also look at, can you somehow associate net promoter score values with growth rates? And they also couldn't replicate the idea that they are associated with one another, that they're correlated.
Paul, I do have a question.
So there's been
one of our students is asking, of the companies that were captured at random, do we know what percent of those actually also happen to use NPS, or is it just that they were random companies that may or may not use NPS?
Oh, somebody's sharp on the, I love talking to researchers.
Yeah, that was a great question, Jennifer. Thank you.
The board of directors would never ask me that. So we do, and I'll share with you data. In general, a third, we've captured data that a little over a third of companies at random, larger companies, use NPS. So in all likelihood, some of those companies were. And to be fair, just because you're using NPS doesn't necessarily mean it's helping you to grow. So this isn't, as a scientist, this is one data point that I would test further. But there's no shortage of critics out there that have tested and have failed to show that NPS values are strongly correlated, and no one has shown that they're causal in terms of predicting growth at a company. Great question. Okay, so here's the conundrum for leadership, and this maybe resonates. How do you replace a well-supported but highly defective tool? So I was having coffee. One of our clients is a chief marketing officer at this large corporation, and I was having coffee with them, and I was telling him, every year, we have to track the NPS value for him, and he uses it, reports it to the board of advisors, who then reports it to during their analyst calls, which is interesting. But I said to him, there's all these problems with it. Here, let me share with you a few of the problems. And he said, well, great, Paul, I appreciate it. So, all well and good. What do we do? What's a better number to use? So we've got a lot of buy-in internally, and everybody's expecting a number. So what other number could I use? So that's in part the challenge, and this is where we ended up doing an experiment. So again, to the point I just mentioned, we looked at this in 2017, and over a third of large corporations, meaning over 500 million in revenue, use Net Promoter Score as one of their tools. But there's criticisms, as I talked about, right? It's from the .com data. It's these categories, again, tending to be intuitive and simple, are arbitrary. You could have picked an 8, 9, and 10 instead of a 9 and a 10, right? And there's no data that really shows that it's correlated with higher corporate growth. But the challenge in adopting something new is also significant. So the processes are well established. So in many large corporations that have adopted NPS, you've got automatic triggers. They've spent tens of millions of dollars putting these systems in place. So at the pharmacy, somebody, as soon as I leave, it triggers a system that then is going to send me an email a couple days later, right? So you've got resources that have been allocated to this tool. The other thing about change is you're going to have to get a multitude of stakeholders to buy into some sort of a new metric. So if you want to switch everything to just customer satisfaction, it's going to take a lot. NPS has gotten a lot of press, a lot of positive adoption, and so getting everybody to switch to a new metric is going to be difficult. And then also, there's few options that appear to be better in terms of being easy to measure, interpret, and understand. And it's the three of these combined that make it really a challenge to change something new. So what we did is we did an experiment specifically designed around, well, if you can't adopt something new, if that's a challenge for an organization, and this tool is unreliable, is there a way to somehow improve NPS as researchers perhaps squint less strongly about looking at, cringe less strongly about this tool in a way that adds more reliability to it? So we did an experiment to look at what's the alternative. And so the approach we used was scientific. So this was an online survey that we conducted with over 1,000 carefully screened consumers. It was about a 5-minute online survey. This sample here, we had all these quotas in place to make sure we balanced gender, we balanced income, we balanced demographic variables to make sure it wasn't skewed to anyone living in Boston, as an example. Pick over there on the East Coast, pick on them. Then we also had screening questions. So the topic the industry we focused in on was health insurance. And we focused there in a time frame when many people are selecting their health insurance during the annual enrollment period at the end of the calendar year. So we did this intentionally with that industry, that time frame, and we screened individuals to make sure that they were somebody that was involved in one way or another with their health insurance. So we didn't want someone that has no relationship with this category. And we screened out any of these darn market researchers that might just cause havoc in our survey. We structured the survey. We had track questions. We asked a number of different questions, some of which I'll share. But we actually designed the experiment so that some would follow and be asked question 1, then 2, then 3. Others would be asked question 3, then 2, then 1. So it was very well designed to make sure not only were we eliminating order effects within a question by rotation, but we were also eliminating the flow of the question from influencing one question to the next question to another. So it was a well-designed experiment. we validated the data, we had trap questions, and then we conducted the analysis. At the end, we removed some individuals that either completed the survey too quickly or gave the same responses, the typical flatliners or speedsters. So we end up with a little over 1,000, worst case scenario margin of error being plus or minus 3% at the 95% confidence interval. Okay. I'll pause in case there's a major question on methodology.
We don't have any questions about the
Okay.
methodology here, but somebody did have an interesting question before, which was, why not just use a simple 3-point scale question? Will recommend, won't recommend, not sure.
Oh, somebody's reading ahead. Okay. We will get there.
Awesome.
We did ask, and whoever that is, send me your resume. You're thinking along our lines. So, okay, so what did we find? So we did ask that question. I'll get to it in a minute. But here's the benchmark U.S. health insurer net promoter score. So this is the results of our 0 to 10 scale. How likely would you be to recommend your health insurer on a scale of 0 to 10? And we programmed it so it was asking about their brand that they told us that they have. And so when you do the calculations, you end up with the promoters there, 9 and 10, 46% are promoters. The detractors, 25%. So in the US, the net promoter score is 21, taking the promoters minus the detractors and just ignoring those passives. So one of the interesting questions, and there's differences between brands. We looked at Cigna versus United, and there is some interesting differences between competitors on these values, and we won't get into that here. But given those scores, this is what they say they would likely do. You could say, okay, well, based on that, what would we expect in terms of word of mouth? Would we expect they'd say something positive, negative, or neither? So based on NPS, this is what you might expect the distribution to be. You might expect that 46%, which are our promoters, would have said something that's positive. So the question we asked, and this was one of the questions in our survey, we said, what have you said about your health insurer over the past year? Have you said something positive, negative, or neither? So based on NPS, you'd say, okay, well, all the promoters perhaps said something positive. That would make sense, 46%. Maybe the passives said neither, 29%. And the negatives, 25%, that seems to correspond with the detractors. This is expected results. What the actual results are more positive. And I'm going to show you those in a minute, but one thing to keep in mind, right, is the Net Promoter Score scale is unipolar. It goes from not at all likely to extremely likely. So it's not asking extremely likely to discourage someone from the brand to extremely likely to encourage someone to the brand. It's actually just asking 0 to 10 on the positive side. And what we find is that while you might expect 25% to be negative, what we find is that the actual results are much more positive. So when we ask, what have you said about your insurer over the past year? Only 6% say they said something negative to someone else. 59%, higher percent than you'd expect based on the percent of promoters, said they said something positive. And then about similar to the number of passives said that they said neither. So when you compare the two, the actual results are very different than what you would expect, and they're a lot more positive. So this is showing the two distributions side by side. And again, one interpretation of this is on the bottom, we asked bipolar distribution. We said, do you say something negative? Do you say something positive, or something in the middle, or neither? On the top, it's based on the distribution that was positive. So it may be on a unipolar scale on NPS, so it may be that simply those 0 through 6 that are considered to be detractors aren't necessarily detractor. That category may not necessarily be called the right thing because they're not necessarily detracting. Similar to me in my pharmacy example, it wasn't that I said I was going to say something negative about the pharmacy. It's just that I wasn't going to say anything positive. I wasn't going to recommend them. Okay, so back to our individual that asked, why don't we just ask the recommendation question directly? So instead of giving them a scale, what we asked in this question was, if someone asked you which company you would choose for health insurance, what would you do? And we gave it, again, positive or negative. This is what the distribution looks like. 64% said that they would tell somebody that they should choose whatever brand they had, Cigna, United, etc. 27% said, I don't really have opinion one way or the other. I wouldn't necessarily say they should go with Cigna as an example, or I wouldn't necessarily say they shouldn't. And then we gave them the option to say, I don't really know, it depends, maybe how I'm feeling that day. And then we asked them, how many, would you discourage them from choosing your brand? Would you be sort of an antagonist for the brand, if you will? And 4% said that they would discourage. So it's important to point out that this is a bipolar scale, right? And categorical. So instead of interpreting what a 8, 9, 10 means, right, we're just saying, would you recommend or not, right? So if we assume that recommendation is a driver of growth, and if we assume asking explicitly we can believe what they say, right, you could argue as a scientist this might be a better way to ask the question as opposed to interpreting a rating scale into categories, to just ask them directly. And these are clearly different results from what NPS would tell you in terms of the percent that are detractors versus the percent that are promoters. So one of our conclusions is that the categories may seem to be one of the key critical errors. So where we'll go with this is, if you have the opportunity, if your organization is using Net Promoter Score, and if you have the opportunity to revise how it's being done, one fix could be to change the categories. So this unipolar scale, promoters, detractors, you get 21. When you look at this categorical comprehensive scale, you get 64% recommending, 4% discouraging. So you could end up with a score of 60. Keep that number in mind. Okay, I'm going to take us through the data a little bit more depth. So if you've got a cup of coffee, maybe take a sip. If there's questions, this might be a good point to pause, because we're going to go a little bit deeper in a second here.
All right, I think I see a couple. Yeah, I
Any
see a couple
burning
people
questions?
typing in. So let's just see what kind of comments we're getting. And we have a couple of interesting things coming in. And first of all, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your wonderful participation. One person is pointing out that it's not human nature to actively recommend everyday brands or products, or even detract from, unless someone specifically asks, which I think it really goes well with the story that you opened with, Paul. So thank you. That was a great story. And also raises the point about the most recent experience versus not specifying a time frame, So, are you, and I say this sometimes in our questionnaire design classes too, if I ask somebody to report a likely future behavior, I don't want it to be open-ended. I want to say something like, how likely are you to do X in the next 30 days? Instead of it just being an open question.
Correct, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about bringing in time frame into these types of questions?
Yes, absolutely. So wholeheartedly agree, right? So in the question example we gave of, would you say something positive, negative, or neither, that was asked within the past year, a behavioral question. And absolutely agree. Whenever possible, putting a time frame in there is important. And it's as important as the asking, what type of question, what your scales are. It's critical, right? So if I were asked, how likely would I be to recommend the pharmacy next week, right? It would certainly be a 0, if not a minus. If I asked, how likely would you be over the next 10 years, right? My my results might be, well, maybe more than a 0, right? If somebody I knew were in the neighborhood and asked me if they should go to a pharmacy that's close by, I might recommend them. So absolutely agree with
Yeah,
both of
and
those
one of our students
points.
is also pointing out that, again, for something like a pharmacy visit that may happen monthly, that she's noticed that they ask NPS based on only the most recent experience. Um, and
Mhm.
it sounds like based on, it sounds like this is a direction that you would find agreeable.
Yes, it's interesting, and in different categories it varies, right? So oftentimes you might have a major mobile phone carrier and you might have an experience with their customer service rep. And following that, they might say, okay, well, based on your interactions with that customer service rep that you had a day or so ago, how likely would you be to recommend the company? And there again, you could argue that context matters and the category matters. So if I am a AT&T customer and my friend is a Verizon customer, based on my experience with that customer service rep, am I going to go to my Verizon friend and say, you know what, you should probably go with AT&T? Probably not, right? Categories matter, and the challenge in using NPS sort of blanketly across categories is that the context is oftentimes lost. And while I think it was Sprint, there was an article showing how their executives, reporting how their executives are compensated based on NPS values. While that might be true, the question that you're asking there may not necessarily be relevant or may not be reliable in terms of what an individual will respond. And so in some cases, when you're asking recommendation, what the individual respondent might really be responding to is how satisfied you were. They may not be as literal in interpreting the
Excellent.
questions.
And it's interesting because one of the comments we just got was from one of our students who's pointing out that C-suite executives do like to be able to compare themselves to other companies. So if they were to change the scale, they wouldn't be able to do that. And so you may have C-suite executives who are like, we're going to stick with this, even if it's not perfect, because I need to be able to compare myself. And there's a lot of benchmark data out there that allows them to do that. So what would you say to the C-suite executive who wants to be able to make that comparison?
A lot of clients that we work with, what we'll do is we'll do a competitive NPS. So say at point in time, say a quarter or an annual study, we'll say, okay, how likely would you be to recommend this brand? And oftentimes it's done blind. So as opposed to AT&T contacting you in this case, asking you how likely you'd be based on your experience, we might be contacting customers that have mobile phones and asking them how likely would you be to recommend whichever phone you have, if it's AT&T, if it's Sprint, and not disclosing who's sponsoring the study. And in the end, you get a net promoter score for a lot of different brands, and you're able to compare yourselves against different brands so that you have that data at the same point in time. Sometimes with benchmark data, you have to be concerned as well as whether there's other things happening in the macroeconomic conditions which could skew how we stack up against the competition if they're not done over the same time period.
Awesome points. Awesome. And then do we think that there's also just some C-suite executives who are going to be like, I don't want to make any changes. I've been tracking this for so long. I've got such great trending data. I don't want to interrupt that. I want to, I really want to keep it going. And so they're just not open to, I mean, do you run into this where you've got C-suite clients who just are not willing to move away from the traditional way of doing NPS?
No, pretty much every person we talk to and we tell them NPS is wrong, they just shift gears 100. No, I'm kidding. No, it's absolutely a challenge, right? And so all of this, as we looked at this and tried to find, is there a way, what we were looking for is there a way to make an incremental improvement, knowing that change is difficult, knowing that investment, and when the board expects one number and they need it every quarter at their quarterly meetings, you got to give them one number, right? And so one of the things we looked at is there just a slight improvement that could be made, even though it's still going to be a challenge, right, to get change adopted. Small changes may be easier than making a large change. even though the large change may be the best approach.
Awesome. We are getting a lot of comments here, Paul, so before I let you go on, I just want to share one more, and there are actually a few, but I'm going to try to consolidate a bit. So we have a student who's asking a question that you slightly touched on before, but she's asking it in a really explicit way, so I want to make sure we post this or pose this. How correlated is likelihood to recommend with satisfaction measures?
So we looked at that in this study, and it varies. There's usually a correlation, and depending on which population you're surveying, what time of year you're surveying, with their relationship interaction with the brand and the product, it can vary. So your R-score value is usually going to be there, but it's a question of how much and how correlated. And unfortunately, for simplicity, it's not simple. It usually varies. But there tends to always be a correlation, and they tend to be a positive correlation. So if you're higher on the recommendation scale, you tend to be higher on the satisfaction scale. And to give Riker credit in terms of that original Harvard Business Review article, he did use satisfaction as one of the questions that they also asked, but he reported that it just wasn't as strong a correlation with growth as recommendation question was.
Excellent, great. Thank you, Paul.
So, okay, so we're going to go a little bit deeper, and let me walk you through this next slide. So before you look at the numbers, let me just walk you through what we're looking at. So this is the 0 to 10 scale on the bottom on your x-axis. And the y-axis is all these people icons are the total percent of individuals. So if you look at 0 as an example, there's 5 little people, and that adds up to 100%, each person representing 20%. So of 100% of people that rated a 0, what we're seeing here is that 18% of them said they would recommend their health insurer brand. On the other end of the spectrum, from the promoters, the individuals that rated 10, so looking at all of those individuals that gave a rating of 10, 93% of them said, when we asked them categorically, would you recommend the brand? 93% said, yes, I would recommend the brand. So we're plotting that for each of these values, and we're categorizing them in the detractor, passives, promoters categories. And where it gets particularly interesting is in the 7 and the 8, the passives. And so when you look at the classically defined promoters, right, you see 9 out of 10, when we ask them directly, would you recommend the brand, say, yes, I'd recommend the brand. So that seems consistent, perhaps expected with the promoters. But a score of 8, 3 out of 4, well over half, say they will recommend. So this begs the question of, by calling them passives and discounting them from a net promoter score value, are we selling ourselves short, right? Are we artificially skewing things negative by just not counting these individuals? For the 7s, we get a 50-50 shot in terms of whether they're going to recommend or not. So one of the things you could potentially say is, if we really want to categorize people into different groups, you might consider the 8, 9s, and 10s to be promoters in this terminology, or brand advocates, if you will. The 7s, yeah, they might fall on one side or the other, and then below that, they're less likely to be recommenders, but there might be some other nuance and differences there if we peeled the onion another layer or two. Okay, so that's one way to slice it. So when you look at the wide majority of 8, 9, and 10, they're going to recommend, right? The other way we can look at the data, another way, is this is the chart on the left we saw earlier. So this is the percent when we ask them categorically, would you recommend, would you discourage someone with your brand, are you not sure? 64% of them said that they would recommend their brand, okay? So if we take that population exclusively, the 64% that said they would recommend based on categories, and we look at their distribution of likelihood to recommend scores using the unipolar scale, here's what the results show. So the 0 to 10 adds up to 100%, and that's because we're looking at 100% of those that said they would recommend the brand, which is 64% of the overall population. Okay, so this is what the results show, and so when you add up the 8, 9, and 10s, you see that 86% of recommenders provide that rating. So this, again, begs the question from a category perspective of, is excluding the 8, 9, and 10, is excluding the 7 and 8s the appropriate approach? What we look at this data, we say there's sort of an elbow there at 8, at 7 and 8. And where I'm leading, and you probably guessed it for now, right, is that perhaps a better approach would be to, instead of calling a promoter a 9 and a 10, but to include those 8s in the calculation. So that's where we're headed in terms of a better solution. So what would that look like? So because this is a unipolar scale, you could call the ones that give us 0, 1, 2, and 3, like myself in this pharmacy example, you could call us non-advocates. And that's what I'm showing on the bottom left of this chart here. So the 2%, 1%, 1%, this is the same distribution we looked at earlier on the 0 to 10 recommendation scale for health insurance. This is actual data, right, that we captured earlier. We're just color coding them, categorizing them differently. So the non-advocates, not saying that I'm not going to recommend the brand, but I'm not going to promote or advocate for the brand. You could consider the 3 through 7 potential advocates, again, not necessarily detractors, but these are potential advocates because we're asking a unipolar scale. And then the advocates, an 8, 9, or a 10. So the intent in coming up with this as a proposed approach is, again, you've spent millions of dollars putting in this infrastructure to ask 0 to 10 rating, right? This adjustment is a slight way of perhaps improving upon the Net Promoter Score by simply recalibrating, recategorizing these. So what you get out of this, if you look at this, just calling this net brand advocacy, because this is an advocacy scale, is if you take the advocates, the 8, 9, and 10s, minus the non-advocates, you'd get a value of 60. And if you remember back, if you were taking notes or look back at the video later, right? The percent that said that they would advocate for the brand, I'll go back there, is 64%. So the numbers here are fairly close, and the numbers get even more closer depending on which way you look at the data. But this is the recommendation, is to make a slight adjustment based on the data. This is what we believe is a better approach, an improved approach. So taking these 3 categories and their stated intentions, what you can see here is we're breaking them out. So the stated intentions, the categories, we said, would you recommend, would you neither, would you discourage, or you don't know what you do. The non-advocates, they skew towards discourage. The potential advocates skew towards neither. And then the advocates skew far towards the right on recommend. And again, as we saw earlier, with just using the traditional Net Promoter Score, it sort of inflated what you would expect to be the percent that are talking, that are negatively speaking about the brand. Here, this is a better representation of the actual stated intentions. And then to go back to the actual behavior, so again, this is the traditional, based on the traditional categories, this is what we said you would predict to see in terms of Would you say something positive, or excuse me, have you said something positive over the last 12 months? Have you said something negative over the past 12 months, or have you said neither? So the top is showing based on Net Promoter Score what you would expect the distribution to be. The bottom is showing what you'd expect to be based on the revised categories. And again, what we found, we showed this earlier, is the actual results were much closer to what these revised categories show. It was much more positively skewed than what you would predict as far as behavior goes based on the traditional Net Promoter Score categories. So that's what these data would suggest, is to go back to merely, it's not a, ideally you might argue as a researcher, as a scientist, as a statistician, this scale should be removed entirely. We should redirect the board and the C-level suite and the VPs, and boy, wouldn't it be great to actually change this. But as an incremental improvement, how do we increase the reliability? This changing the category seems like a valid approach, at least based on these data within the health insurance market, as a way to look at this differently. With that, I will stop and turn it over for Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. And I do see some people typing, so folks, please continue to type in your questions. Paul, I'm just curious while people add in their more questions. Can you share any experiences about variations by vertical industry? For example, would you have a greater sense of urgency about making this change for people from certain vertical industries versus others?
I guess the one question that we always ask is how is the Net Promoter Score being used by an individual within the industry? So in some instances, let's take technology, where we spend a lot of time in healthcare and technology. In technology, in some brands, their Net Promoter Score is extremely high and extremely stable over time. In a situation like that, and in some industries where there's a lot of, there's few competitors, you might argue the need to change, if you're stable, if you have a very high Net Promoter Score, your need to change to a new model may not be as important compared to another industry where your Net Promoter Score is changing quite a bit, and how that's being used is more short-term. So oftentimes with some companies, what you'll see is there's a large percent of individuals that are in that passive, in that 7 and 8 category, and a slight adjustment, if suddenly your 8s become 9s, your Net Promoter Score can jump quite a bit. And if you're relying that on a month-to-month basis, improving the scale and having it reflect more of the real intentions and behaviors of individuals could be more important than if you're looking at Net Promoter Score over a year and making slight changes to your strategy based on it.
That intersects really well with a couple of the comments that are coming in now. So let me read a couple, or I'll read them one at a time. Going off of the how is it being used question, how are people actually using Net Promoter Score? Is it, really just for executive bonuses, or is the C-suite actually using this to inform strategic decisions? Do you have any advice for companies who are advocates of using NPS but don't really get actionable takeaways from it?
So in terms of actionable takeaways, what's often asked, and my pharmacy example didn't, but what's often asked, which can be very helpful, is after asking that 0 to 10 rating scale, following up with why. So why is it that you gave the rating that you did? And oftentimes, it's as a researcher, it can be cumbersome if you're coding 1,000 responses. But what you can, and oftentimes if somebody's doing a survey, they may not be as elaborate as you'd like, so you have to word questions or encourage individuals to give you more in-depth feedback. But if you can get a good response and a large set of responses to a why did you give the rating you did, that can often provide useful input to strategies, especially if some themes come up quite a bit. Like, I gave you that response because every time I call customer service, it takes me 10 minutes to get through, right? As an example. So that's one way in which you can, if you're an advocate of it, you can get some more value out of that tool.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Another comment that's very interesting, I'm just going to read this one verbatim. One of the issues in insurance, including health insurance, are USAA's monster NPS scores, which all C-suites aspire to. Any workarounds for these aspirations?
Any workarounds if you're an insurer and you want to get beyond the strongest competitor? One thing that oftentimes organizations will do is look at who are the detractors and what is it that could shift them. We often find that organizations that look at the passives, the 7 and 8s, raters, what's going on with them? And if you, again, if there is a large chunk, which often there is, oftentimes these curves are skewed, if you have a large 7 and 8s, what is it that could be done to address that population specifically? Can you do a deeper dive into that population? In some instances, what we've seen is that those with shorter tenure with an organization, maybe they haven't been onboarded as well as those that have been with the company a long time. So insurance, oftentimes, if you've been with the insurer for 5-10 years, you may be more likely to stay than if you're a new member. So looking at those 7 and 8s, looking at the tenures and maybe differences between the populations that are giving high ratings and lower ratings can oftentimes help. But it can be hard when some insurers, in this case USAA, are extremely well regarded if your goal is to reach that goal.
Great points. Thank you so much. Another student is asking, were you able to correlate the more direct question approach with growth?
In this study, we did not look at growth. We have replicated this study over time. We haven't published the data yet. What we did that was interesting is we looked at people that completed the survey and we asked a year later what their results are. And the companies there, we may end up looking at the growth rates. There's a lot of factors that go into growth rates, and so to presume that one tool and an increase in NPS is going to increase share prices or overall top-line revenue or net profitability, as a scientist, concerns me because there's so many other variables. But is certainly an analysis that can be done, and we may end up looking at that further.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, I know, folks, that we are just about out of time, but and I'll keep my eyes on the chat to see if more questions come in. But gosh, I do think it would be wonderful to have everybody vote on this question. How likely are you to recommend Net Promoter Score to a friend or a colleague? And I'll give everybody a chance to vote before I broadcast the results. Oh, people are still voting. People are thinking about it, Paul. That's a question. How much do we want people to think about this? Should it be a gut reaction, or do we want people to really ponder?
You can only vote once.
Awesome. I still see some votes coming in, but I'm going to go ahead and display. And from the display, you can see that we have quite the distribution, from people being very unlikely to people being. We got a bunch around 8. We only have one person giving it a 10. So we seem to be concentrated in the 4 to 8 range. So some and some low scores too. So we've got some variation here. I would have a pretty big standard deviation on this one, Paul.
Yeah, and just doing the Net Promoter Score calculation on the Net Promoter Score rating, it looks like we're in the negative, with 5 at 8 at 10, 5% at 8 and 25% at 8. If we use the net brand advocacy, we're at a score of 0. So depending how you slice it, it looks like we're not doing too well here as a net promoter score advocacy group.
We've got a lot of people who are very critical thinkers here. So, which is awesome, right? So everybody here is looks at everything very cautiously. And Paul, I do want to thank you so much for your time today. The information that you shared was wonderful, and I know we all really appreciate the rigor of doing research on research, and the fact that you actually do experiments is so important to us, because obviously there are a lot of people who speculate and pontificate about NPS pros and cons, but to talk to somebody like you who's actually done experiments and, oh my God, replicated them, it's a very rare thing. So such a valuable thing, and you're getting some nice kudos here from our students. So thank you so much. Folks, I'll keep the classroom open for a couple more minutes in case anybody has any other questions or comments. But with that, I am going to turn off.